Chapter 28.
"Bring her forward."
Ragnak's massive voice, used to dominating the howling gales of the Stormwight, boomed painfully in the low-ceilinged hall. Evalyn shrank back instinctively, then recovered as Halt touched her arm and met her eyes with a reassuring smile. She straightened her shoulders and drew herself up to full height. Will watched in admiration as she walked down the cleared space in the center of the hall. Halt, Eric, and the two apprentices followed close behind her. Horace, Will noticed, was continually easing his sword in its scabbard, lifting it to free the blade, then allowing it to drop back again. Will's own hand strayed to the hilt of his throwing knife. If things went as badly as they all feared, he decided that knife was for Slegor, who was standing beside and slightly behind Ragnak. Once before in Skorgajal, Will had demonstrated his skill with the knife to Eric's and Slegor's crews, throwing it across the room and skewering a small wooden keg next to Slegor's hand. This time, there would be no keg. The room watched in utter silence as Evalyn stopped before Ragnak's raised dais. She met the Oberjarl's glower with a calm, composed expression on her face. Again, Will found himself almost overwhelmed by her courage and her composure. Slegor signaled to a pair of attendants by a side door.
"Bring in the slave,"
he called. His voice was soft and silky, totally unlike Ragnak's forceful bellow. He sounded very pleased with the current turn of events, Will thought. The two men, rowers from Slegor's crew, opened the door and dragged in a protesting, weeping figure. She was a middle-aged woman, her hair graying and her face lined before its time with the strain of unending labor, poor food, and the threat of constant punishment that was the lot of a slave in Halisholm. The sailors dragged her forward and cast her down on the floor in front of Evalyn. She crouched there miserably, her eyes down.
"Look up, slave,"
Slegor said in the same quiet voice. Her sobbing continued, and she shook her head, her eyes still cast down at the floor. Slegor moved quickly, stepping down from the platform and drawing his sax knife in one smooth movement. He held the razor-sharp blade below the woman's chin, pressing it into the flesh of her neck with not quite sufficient force to break the skin.
"I said, look up,"
he repeated, and applied pressure to the knife to raise her eyes until she was gazing at Evalyn. As she saw the girl, the woman began sobbing even louder.
"Shut up,"
Slegor told her.
"Shut up that noise, and tell the Oberjarl what you told me."
There were angry welts across the woman's face. Obviously, she had been recently beaten. Her ragged shift was torn in several spots as well, and more red marks were visible on her body through the gaps. In some places, blood had soaked through the thin material. Her tear-filled eyes pleaded with Evalyn.
"I'm sorry, my lady," she said, her voice breaking. "They beat me until I told."
Evalyn took an involuntary step forward toward her, but Slegor's knife swung up and around to confront her and stop her from coming closer. Beside him, Will heard Horace's quick intake of breath and saw his hand fall to the sword hilt once more. He placed his own hand over Horace's, stopping him from drawing the sword. The heavily built apprentice looked at him, surprised. Will shook his head slightly. He realized that Horace's movement had been a reflex action, and he knew that in this tinderbox atmosphere, if his friend ever drew that sword, it could mean the end of all of them. "Not yet," he mouthed the words. If the time came, he was willing to join Horace in an attack on Slegor and Ragnak, but first, he thought, they should see if Halt couldn't talk their way out of the situation. "Leave the talking to me," the ranger had told them before they left his apartment. "And don't do anything until I tell you. Clear?" The two boys had nodded. Then Halt had added, "This puts an altogether different slant on our accusing Slegor, of course." "But surely you're still going to tell Ragnak?" Will had burst out. Halt had shook his head doubtfully. "The problem is, he's got in first. If we make a counter-accusation now, it'll look as if we're simply doing it to save Evalyn. Chances are, Ragnak will ignore it altogether." "But you can't let him get away with—" Will began. But Halt held up a hand to silence him. "I'm not letting him get away with anything," he reassured them. "We'll just have to pick the right time to bring the matter up, that's all." Now Slegor turned back to the woman on the floor.
"Tell the Oberjarl," he repeated.
The woman said nothing, and Slegor turned to Ragnak in exasperation.
"My head slave overheard her telling some of the others," he explained. "She's a Ralhuin originally, and she said she recognized this girl here."
He jerked a thumb in Evalyn's direction.
"As the Princess Cassandra, Duncan's daughter."
Ragnak's eyes narrowed as he turned slightly to inspect Evalyn. Her chin went up, and she stood a little taller under his gaze.
"She does have something of the look of Duncan about her," he said suspiciously.
No, I was mistaken," the slave burst out suddenly. On her knees, she stretched her hands out to Slegor in supplication. "Now I see her close to. I realize I was wrong, Lord Slegor. I was mistaken."
"You called her my lady," Slegor reminded her.
"It was a mistake, that was all. A mistake. Now I see her proper. I can tell it's not her," the woman insisted.
Slegor regarded her with a pained expression on his face. He turned to Ragnak again.
"She's lying, Oberjarl," he said. "I'll have my men beat the truth out of her."
He made a signal to the two men again, and one of them came forward, uncoiling a short, thick whip as he came. The woman cringed away from him.
"No, please, my lord, please."
Her voice was shrill with fear as she tried to crawl away. Slegor's man grabbed a handful of her hair to stop her, and she cried out again, in pain as well as in fear. He raised the vicious-looking whip over his head, ready to bring it down. "Leave her alone!" Evalyn cried, and her voice froze the sailor where he stood. He looked uncertainly to Slegor for direction, but the wolf-ship captain was watching Evalyn, waiting for her to say more.
"All right," she said quietly. "There's no need for torture. My name is Cassandra."
The silence in the room was almost a physical force. Then an excited buzz broke out among the assembled crowd. Will distinctly heard the word Valisvow from several different sources.
"Silence!"
roared Ragnak, and instantly the noise ceased. He rose and moved forward to confront Evalyn, glaring down at her.
"You are Duncan's daughter?"
She hesitated, then replied. "I am King Duncan's daughter," she said, with a slight emphasis on his title. "Cassandra, Princess of Ralhuin."
"Then you are my enemy," he said, spitting the words out, "and I have sworn that you should die."
Eric stepped forward.
"And I have sworn that she will be safe here, Oberjarl," he said. "I gave my word when I asked the ranger to help us."
Ragnak looked up angrily. Again there was a buzz of conversation through the room. Eric was a popular jarl among the Skandians, and Ragnak hadn't reckoned on having to contend with him over this matter. There was an invading army only days away from his stronghold. He knew he couldn't afford to split with his senior war leader.
"I am Oberjarl," he said. "My vow is of greater importance."
Eric folded his arms across his chest.
"Not to me it isn't," he said,
and there was a chorus of agreement from the crowd.
"Eric cannot defy you like this. You are Oberjarl,"
Slegor suddenly interjected.
"Have him imprisoned. He is defying your vow to the Valis." "Shut up, Slegor," Eric told him in an ominously calm voice. Then he readdressed himself to Ragnak. "I didn't ask you to take your death vow, Ragnak," he said. "But if you want to carry it out, I'm afraid you're going to have to go through me to do it." Now Ragnak stepped down from his podium and walked closer to where Eric stood. They were of equal height, both massively built. He faced his old companion, the anger burning in his eyes. "Eric, did you know who she was when you brought her here?"
Eric shook his head. Slegor snorted in disgust.
"Of course he knew," he cried,
then stopped suddenly as the point of Eric's dagger appeared under his nose.
"I'll allow that once," Eric told him. "Say it again, and you're a dead man."
Wordlessly, Slegor backed away from the bigger man, putting a safe distance between himself and the point of the knife. Eric sheathed the dagger and turned back to Ragnak.
"I didn't know," he said. "Otherwise, I would never have brought her here, knowing of your vow. But the fact remains, I vouch for her safety, and my word is all important to me, as is yours to you." "Blast it, Eric!" Ragnak shouted. "The Temujai are only 3 or 4 days' march from here. We can't afford to be fighting amongst ourselves now."
"It would be a shame if you had to face the Temujai with that last one, and possibly both, if your best leaders were dead," Halt put in mildly. And the Oberjarl rounded on him in a fury.
"Shut up, Ranger! I've of half a mind to believe that this is all your doing. No good ever came from dealing with your kind."
Halt shrugged, unimpressed by the Skandian's fury. "Be that as it may," he said, "it occurs to me that there might be a solution to your problem. For the time being, at least." The buzz of conversation through the room was cut short as Ragnak swung his gaze around angrily. He watched Halt with narrowed eyes, expecting some trick or some kind of subterfuge.
"What are you talking about? My vow is binding upon me," he said.
Halt nodded agreement. "I understand that. But is there any time factor involved?" he asked. Now Ragnak looked puzzled as well as suspicious.
"Time factor? What do you mean?"
"If we accept that you plan to do your best to kill Evalyn, knowing that Eric will try to stop you when you do, not to mention the fact that if he doesn't, I most certainly will. Have you vowed that you'll do it at any particular time?" Halt continued. The puzzled expression on Ragnak's face grew more intense.
"No, I didn't specify any time. I just made the vow," he said finally.
And Halt nodded several times. "Good. So, as far as these Valis are concerned, they don't care whether you try to fulfill your vow today, or if you choose to wait until, say, after we've sent the Temujai packing." Understanding was beginning to dawn on the Oberjarl's face.
"That's right," he said slowly. "As long as the intent is there, the Valis will be satisfied."
"No!" A shrill voice cut across them. It was Slegor, the silky, self-satisfied tones gone from his voice now.
"Can't you see, Oberjarl? They're trying to trick you. He has something in mind. The girl must die. She must die now. Otherwise your sworn word will be worthless."
Slegor's anger and his long-held desire for revenge on Evalyn for the events that had occurred on Skorgajil had caused him to go too far. Ragnak turned on him now, a flame of anger burning in his eyes.
"Slegor, I would advise you to get rid of this reckless habit of yours, telling your peers that they're liars," he said,
and instantly the wolf ship captain retreated with his accusation. Of course, Oberjarl, I didn't mean—"
Ragnak cut him off. "My first concern is for the safety of Skandia. With these Temujai on our doorstep, Eric and I cannot afford to be fighting. If he'll agree to postpone our differences until after we've settled them, then I will too."
Eric nodded agreement instantly.
"It sounds like a good compromise to me."
There was still one thread of suspicion in Ragnak's mind. He turned back to Halt, his heavy knitted brows together in a frown.
"I can't help wondering what's in it for you, Ranger. All you've done is win postponement."
Halt inclined his head slightly to one side as he considered the matter. "True," he replied, "but a lot can happen in the next few days. You might be killed in battle, or Eric, or me, or all 3 of us. Besides that, my immediate priority is the same as yours, to see these Temujai driven back. After all, if they win here, they won't be long before they'll be invading Aralion as well. I have a sworn duty to try to prevent that." He smiled grimly. "That's another of those vows that we all seem to be too rushed about taking. Blasted nuisances, aren't they?" Ragnak turned and stepped back up on his dais to his massive council chair.
"We're agreed, then," he said. "We'll settle the Temujai question first. Then we'll come back to this problem."
Eric and Halt exchanged glances. Then both men nodded. Only Slegor seemed to be in disagreement with the compromise. He muttered a curse under his breath. Halt took Evalyn's arm and began to guide her from the great hall, followed by the two apprentices and Eric. They hadn't gone half a dozen paces when Halt turned back to Ragnak.
"Of course, there is one more question that I'd like to hear Slegor answer," he said.
As he hoped, at the mention of his name, everyone in the room involuntarily glanced at Slegor. Then, when all eyes were on him, Halt continued.
"Perhaps he could tell us what his ships are doing at Falcork Island."